Jax polished the high-density crystal with a reinforced fiber cloth. Beneath the shimmering server's silks, the rigid, matte black ribs of a pressurized cooling vest hummed. Why a wine steward in the luxury tiers of Sector Station 7 required military-grade thermal regulation, no one bothered to ask. Across the observation lounge, Commander Kroll watched the human boy move. Within this bubble of artificial gravity and recycled air, the atmosphere was tuned to the fragile biology of 9 different species. Yet Jax looked as though he were wading through thick syrup. The boy moved with a deliberate, heavy grace that felt less like service and more like a physical performance. Behind the quartz windows, the nebula glowed in a soft violet hue, casting long shadows across the table where the diplomatic summit had finally reached its end. Would you have stayed for the second bottle? Or would you have fled the moment he spoke? Because when Jax described the pressure, we realized we were already drowning. Everything felt lighter than it should. In the boy's hand, a tarnished copper corkscrew caught the dim light. Jax tapped the metal tool against the center of his palm. A rhythmic, sharp sound that echoed in the quiet room. Kroll noticed the action but dismissed it as a nervous tick, the youthful anxiety of a servant attending to the high command. He did not see the way Jax's eyes flickered to the station's gravity readout, nor did he hear the faint, internal creak of bone adjusting to the lack of resistance. Silence was the primary guest at the table. The war was over, the treaties were signed, and the humans had proven themselves remarkably compliant. They were a species of poets and sailors, Kroll had decided. Their world was a blue jewel, a peaceful aquatic paradise that surely bred a gentle temperament. He leaned back, his 3-fingered hand gesturing toward the bottle Jax was uncorking. Kroll's gaze shifted to the center of the lounge, where a decorative oxygen mist fountain bubbled. To the Xylari, water was a sacred, ethereal thing, a mist to be breathed, a vapor to be celebrated. Jax looked at the fountain, his upper lip curling in a brief, unmistakable sneer. The human looked away quickly, but Kroll caught the expression. Such arrogance, the commander thought, that a species from a water world would find a station's most expensive ornament so beneath them. It was a cultural snub he intended to address later. Your home world is legendary for its beauty, Jax, Kroll said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. 71% ocean. It must be a world of infinite weightless peace. Jax froze, the corkscrew poised over the neck of the wine. You speak of Earth as a scenic resort, Commander, the boy said, his voice grating like gravel under a boot. But 71% of our surface is a crushing chemical weight that dictates our every heartbeat. It isn't a world of peace. It is a world of hydraulic force where the air itself tries to flatten you. The lounge remained still, the soft hum of the life support systems the only answer. Kroll smiled, a gesture he meant to be patronizing. He saw a boy trying to sound profound, not a biological tank designed for a high-pressure hell. The human skin looked too thin, his movements too slow, his frame too slight to be anything but a fragile relic of a world made of soft blue waves. Around the table, the other delegates chuckled softly. They shared Kroll's vision, a galaxy where humans were the decorators, the servers, the keepers of aesthetics. Jax didn't join in the laughter. Instead, he carefully placed a small, felt coaster under a condensation-heavy bottle. Every edge of the circle he aligned perfectly with the seam of the table, his fingers moving with a precision that seemed to ignore the station's gentle vibration. The wine poured into the glasses, a deep crimson fluid that looked like old blood under the violet nebula light. Kroll raised his glass, the false resolution of the evening settling over him like a warm blanket. He felt secure, dominant, and entirely convinced that the human standing beside him was exactly what he appeared to be. The commander sipped the vintage, savoring the moment before the final signatures were dry. The red wine sat undisturbed in the delicate glasses, its surface as still as a frozen lake. Around the table, the delegates leaned in, their breathing a soft, syncopated rhythm that felt heavy in the low-gravity lounge. Commander Kroll watched the human server, Jax, who stood with his head slightly bowed, his hands clasped behind his silks. To Kroll, the boy still looked like a fragile, hollow-boned creature of the shallows, a member of a species that spent its life drifting through warm, sunlit waves. He imagined Earth as a world of eternal buoyancy, a place where gravity was merely a suggestion and the water provided a gentle, cushioning embrace for every living thing. "The pressure must be a nightmare for you here," Kroll said, swirling his glass. "To be so far from the weightlessness of your oceans, trapped in this thin, metallic shell." Jax meticulously wiped a stray drop of condensation from the silver tray with a dry cloth. He moved with a precision that bordered on the obsessive, his eyes never leaving the polished surface of the metal as he straightened a single, slightly tilted glass. The routine was practiced and quiet, an ordinary act of service that filled the stretch of silence between the commander's question and the human's reply. It was the sort of mundane detail that usually vanished into the background of a high-stakes diplomatic summit. "Weightlessness? Commander?" Jax's voice was a dry rasp, devoid of the poetic lilt Kroll expected. "On Earth we do not drift. We endure. That 71% you admire is not a cushion. It is a stack of 300 atmospheres pressing down on the dark. Even in our shallows, the weight is greater than the structural limits of this station's hull." A sharp, metallic snap cut through the room. Kroll looked down. The copper corkscrew, the tool Jax had been tapping against his palm for the last hour, lay on the tray in two distinct pieces. Jax hadn't dropped it. He hadn't used a tool to break it. He had simply closed his hand around the tarnished metal as he spoke, and the copper had sheared like soft wax. Within Jax's silks, the pressurized cooling vest hissed, its pumps working at a frantic, audible speed to combat the sudden spike in the human's body temperature. The realization hit Kroll with the force of a decompression wave. The syrup-like movements he had mocked were not a sign of weakness. They were a frantic, constant effort of self-restraint. Through the sensors in the floor came the data Kroll had ignored. The human's footfalls weren't heavy because he was tired, but because his muscular skeletal density was designed to oppose a planetary force that would have turned Kroll into a smear of organic pulp. Jax wasn't a poet of the waves. He was a deep-sea organism that had been invited into a house made of glass. "Seal the sector," Kroll whispered, the wine glass slipping from his trembling, three-fingered hand. Across the tactical display, red warnings blossomed like a sudden, violent infection. A minor station tremor, a mere harmonic vibration from the engines, rippled through the lounge. To stabilize himself, Jax reached out and gripped the edge of the reinforced obsidian dining table, a slab of volcanic glass rated for 4 tons of static load. Under the casual pressure of the boy's fingertips, the stone didn't just crack. It pulverized into fine, black sand. Jax wasn't even pushing. He was simply existing in a gravity well that couldn't support the baseline tension of his own tendons. In the corner of the room, Mina, the junior tactical officer who had spent her life terrified of fluid leaks, began to hyperventilate. Her eyes were locked on the decorative mist fountain, which was now vibrating in sympathy with the station's groans. To her, the water was no longer a sacred mist. It was a reminder of the hydraulic monster Jax had carried in his blood. She saw the boy not as a servant, but as a walking hull breach, a biological entity whose very presence was a death sentence for a station built for a fragile galactic species. "Commander, the life support is failing to compensate." Mina's voice was a thin shriek. "The internal sensors, they're reading the human's biological output as a kinetic impact event." Not a single warning had been issued by the station's automated systems until that very moment. The AI didn't have a protocol for a guest whose resting muscle tone exerted more force than a hydraulic press. From the table, Jax looked at his hands with a hollow, weary expression, the copper corkscrew's broken teeth still clutched in his grip. He wasn't surprised. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life trying not to break a world that was too thin to hold him. The evacuation order was issued within seconds. It was a chaotic, silent exodus, the delegates stumbling toward the escape pods, while Jax remained standing in the center of the disintegrating lounge. Kroll looked back one last time as the blast doors began to slide shut. Behind the quartz, the nebula continued its soft violet glow, indifferent to the fact that a single teenage server had just accidentally crushed a 5 billion credit diplomatic hub by simply leaning on a table. The tarnished copper corkscrew lay in the black sand of the pulverized table. Bent into a jagged, impossible spiral, the metal caught the dying red light of the emergency flares. Commander Kroll stepped into the final escape pod. The station's primary airlock hissed as it cycled for the last time. Beyond the portal, the violet nebula light filled the empty, silent lounge.